It was a long text, so I appreciate you getting through that. So for those of you who don't know, I am what some of you might call a board game junkie. I have a significant number of board games squirreled away in our basement at home. It's a hobby that I've been involved in for about 15 years. I'm very grateful because my wife, to some degree, shares an interest in it, so it gives us a chance to spend some time together. One of the things that I enjoy is reading and getting to understand the rules. I like to see how the mechanics work together, what the game designer is trying to accomplish, and then I enjoy teaching other people how to play. In fact, I have kind of developed a bit of a reputation among some of our friends where they will go out and buy a game that they want to learn how to play, give it to me, I'll read the rules, and then teach them how to play, and then they get to keep the game, and I did all the work. When you play a game, you discover pretty quickly that the rules are very important. If someone decides to ignore the rules, it detracts from the fun of everyone who is playing. The same can be said for sports. 2 weeks ago, we had the Super Bowl, which was viewed by 123 million people. Can you imagine what would happen if the football players went out in the field and then just decided to play by their own rules, the level of chaos that would ensue in that situation? Nobody knowing whether or not they won or lost or whatever, it would just be absolute chaos. The same can be said for civilizations. We have rules that we must obey, otherwise we could get a ticket or get a fine or end up arrested and in jail. But if you remove those rules or you disregarded them, then we would have what is commonly known as anarchy. However, when it comes to relationships, following rules is often not enough. For example, my wife and I know that good communication is necessary for a healthy marriage. But if I were to approach communication with my wife in a superficial way, focusing on routine updates or obligatory exchanges of information without delving into more meaningful or personal topics, it wouldn't be the same as me sharing how I felt, my thoughts, my feelings, my vulnerabilities. It's about connecting with my wife on a deeper level, which you can't do with superficial communication. Similarly, if I get up every morning and read my Bible because I view it as a rule for my relationship with Jesus, that relationship will suffer. But if I read the Bible with an understanding that it is the primary way of getting to know who Jesus is, and I respond prayerfully, my relationship with Jesus has the potential to grow. To oversimplify my point, laws and rules are good and required for society to function. But simply following rules alone is not sufficient for cultivating healthy relationships. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus demonstrates that even the more civil laws are about interpersonal relationships, and that how we treat others is a reflection of the condition of our hearts. The Ten Commandments, for example, are about having right relationships with God and people. Having right relationships is one way of viewing righteousness, which, if you remember back to the Beatitudes, is something that we are to hunger and thirst for. In addition, when asked about the greatest commandment, Jesus responds saying that the two greatest commands are to have a right relationship with God and others. Having right relationships is more than following a list of do's and don'ts. It's about having your heart transformed by a right relationship with God. Have you ever stopped to think about this? Do you think about the health of your relationships being a result of simply following rules? Or do you find that you've been trying to be good enough by following God's rules to earn his favor? In our passage this morning, Jesus teaches us how to live out the heart of God's law, challenging us to reflect God's perfect love in every aspect of life. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at each of the 6 case studies Jesus uses to reveal God's heart to his followers. Interestingly, Jesus starts with murder. After Adam and Eve's rebellion in the garden, what was the first recorded sin in the Bible? Anybody? Murder. It was Cain and Abel. The first thing they rebelled, first thing happens is one human kills another. On the surface, do not murder is a fairly simple thing to accomplish on a day-to-day basis. At the end of your day, you may have a routine where you brush your teeth, you put on your PJs, and maybe you take a moment to think about the day, and you ask yourself, did I kill anybody today? No. Cool. On a societal level, that is a win, and the town you live in is grateful for your agreeableness not to murder anybody. But Jesus reveals that God has a higher standard. What is it about being angry and insulting people that puts it on the same level as murder? Quite simply, when we insult or call someone foolish or stupid, we are devaluing someone whom God has put a great deal of value into. Last week, we had the opportunity to hear Stephen Russell speak, and he spoke about what it means to be made in the image of God. If you missed that, if you weren't here, it's on our website, and I strongly encourage you guys to go check it out. To summarize what he said, because we are made in God's image, we have an intellect and a moral code. We are co-regents with God, his representatives. We have an identity as his sons and daughters, and he has given us dignity as a person. That is what it means to be made in the image of God. So when we attack someone's character, we are attacking the dignity of an image of God. Kind of puts things in perspective, doesn't it? One of the problems we have in modern Western culture is that we are so disconnected from each other. It's so easy to get mad at another driver and call them an idiot and a moron because we don't know them. We have no connection to that person. But have you ever been driving somewhere and got annoyed with someone and called them all kinds of names and insulted their competence as drivers and then realized you know the person? How did that make you feel? I remember one time I was behind someone driving down 130, and I considered their driving to be subpar, and all I wanted was for them to get out of my way. I was frustrated and angry, and I unfortunately was going to the same place they were going. Here. I was following and raging against someone that I went to church with. All of a sudden, that driver became a person, and I felt guilty about the things I had said. The same thing can happen on the internet, or when we watch someone on TV who we don't agree with. We feel safe saying all kinds of horrible things because we are disconnected from them and don't see them as people. But from what Jesus says in verses 23 and 24, harboring anger, resentment, and or unresolved conflict takes priority over our offerings to God. Because we are made in the image of God, our relationships with people in our lives will impact our relationship with our King. The last statement Jesus makes on the topic sounds like a little transactional on the first read. But if we take a moment and consider all the things we've talked about so far, you'll begin to see that it is anything but transactional. At first, it comes across sounding like Jesus is encouraging us to resolve our issues with what he calls our adversaries before we get in trouble with the law. However, there's a difference between interpersonal laws and civil laws. When we examine God's heart, we find he wants us to resolve our issues with people directly and not in the civic legal system. The Apostle Paul talks about this in his first letter to the Corinthian church when he exhorts the believers there to settle their issues among themselves and not involve the courts. We are to strive to have right relationships with others, and we do that by going to them directly to resolve issues. This is very countercultural today because most people avoid conflict like the plague. But Jesus pushes us toward it in order to restore our relationships with our community. Jesus moves on to a topic that can be a little uncomfortable: lust. And he uses wildly rhetorical terms to express how important this issue is. Unlike murder, which is fairly easy to get through the day without committing, at least in the civil view of the word, adultery is, sadly, far more common. Statistically, someone in this room has committed adultery. However, when we consider Jesus' revelation of God's heart on the matter, it is safe to say that we are all guilty of it. Now, I know about 50% of you are going to say, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never lusted after anybody. But that would maybe be because you're considering that we're talking explicitly about being physically intimate with someone else other than your spouse. However, lust is not exclusively a physical thing. If you have ever thought that you would like to have a spouse who is more caring, more sensitive, more compassionate, or any number of qualities that many of us lack, you have lusted after an emotional relationship with someone other than the one you have with your spouse. Now, I want to be clear that Jesus is not instructing his followers to mutilate themselves over this issue, but rather he uses hyperbole to express how severely we should address it. For example, if you have a flirty relationship with someone at work, you need to cut that kind of relationship out of your life. If you read, watch, or scroll through any kind of media that causes you to lust, you need to gouge that routine out of your daily practice. To paraphrase, it is better for you to lose your social media platform than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. This also is directly related to remembering that your spouse is an image of God and the person that you're lusting for is an image of God. Once again, it gives you an interesting perspective, doesn't it? Jesus moves on to an even more delicate topic, divorce. For some reason, modern American church has demonized divorce, treating it like it is the unforgivable sin. Yes, it is wrong. Yes, God made it clear from the beginning that a husband and a wife are two people who become one. And yes, Jesus states that what God has brought together, no man should separate. But Jesus also says that he did not come into the world to condemn the world, but to save it. In his letter to the Romans, Paul makes it clear that there is nothing in this world or the next that can separate us from the love of God. Except divorce. No, not even divorce. Later in Matthew, Jesus explains why the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, allowed divorce in the first place. And it was because of the hard heart of God's people. Jesus' goal in this section of the Sermon on the Mount is to reveal God's heart and to demonstrate what a transformed heart looks like. Jesus even gives his followers an out, both here and in chapter 19, because of our continued hard hearts. But in the end, God doesn't want anyone to get divorced, but he still loves you if you have been divorced. Do not let your past mistakes diminish your status as an image of God, and do not let others take away your dignity as a child of God. Marriage is a commitment. It's a promise between two people that reflects God's covenant with us, which is why it's so heartbreaking to see marriages fall apart. When our hearts are transformed by having a right relationship with God, it impacts everything we do, including the words we speak. So when we make promises like the one a bride and groom make in their wedding vows, it is to be taken very seriously. Jesus touches on this when he says that we should not take oaths or swear on anything other than our own integrity. I'm in the military. I have been since I first took an oath of enlistment back in 1993. This is because I haven't been to work in 2 weeks. It'll be gone tomorrow when I go back to work. It's one of my wife's biggest laments. I have to shave every day for work. So since 1993, I've taken the same oath multiple times. Every couple of years, I have to re-enlist. When you take an oath of enlistment, you stand before an American flag in front of an officer, you raise your right hand, and then he gives you some things to repeat. You say your name, and then he or she will ask you if you solemnly swear or affirm your oath. Now, some people over the years have interpreted this passage as a prohibition against making any kind of commitment by swearing, hence the addition of the word affirm in the oath of enlistment. The ironic part is that Jesus had no intention of adding any additional rules to the law. As I mentioned earlier, Jesus' goal here is to reveal God's heart and show us what a transformed heart looks like. When it comes to making a promise to someone in our community, a simple yes or no should suffice. When we interact with each other as a community, there should be an inherent trust among us. That trust is based on the relationships we have with each other. If I were to ask Lee to do something for me or to keep something to himself that I shared with him, he doesn't have to swear that he's going to be true to his word. He doesn't have to make an oath for me to believe him. We've known each other long enough that I know his character and I know I can trust him. When our hearts are being transformed by the right relationship with God, it will be evident in our personal interactions with each other. In this light, Jesus' teaching on oaths transcends the letter of the law, guiding us toward a community where integrity forms the bedrock of our interactions. This transformative approach to our words and promises mirrors the profound trust and faith we place in God's promises to us. As we strive for relationships marked by such trust and sincerity, the need for formal oaths is diminished. Our yes becomes a testament to our character, and our no a reflection of our discernment, both rooted in a heart transformed by God's grace. In embodying this principle, we not only honor God, but we also forge stronger, more authentic connections with those around us, demonstrating the kingdom's values in every word we speak and promises we make. We live in a world where broken promises can lead to hurt and mistrust, so it's natural to think of retaliation when trust is breached. However, Jesus invites us to a higher calling. Beyond maintaining integrity in our words, he challenges us to respond to betrayal, not with revenge, but with grace. This shift from seeking justice through retaliation to offering forgiveness reflects the heart of the gospel. First mentioned in Exodus, the idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is expressed to ensure a measured response is used when seeking justice. For example, you wouldn't kill someone because they knocked a tooth out. However, God felt it was required to establish this measured response, so there must have been a reason in that community for such a law. It's kind of like there's a sign underneath sprinkler heads in hotels that say, please do not hang things from the sprinkler head. It's because someone did hang something from the sprinkler head and probably flooded the room. Rules are not made for arbitrary purposes. There's a reason behind the rules that even God makes for community relations. Now, this passage has been interpreted in various ways, including a call to pacifism by some, advocating for a life of nonviolence and peace. However, interpretations vary, and some see it more as a guide for personal behavior rather than a political stance on all forms of violence or conflict resolution. When our kids were little, we taught them not to respond with violence with more violence. We told them that if someone pushes you or does something physically, punching, kicking, whatever, that you should tell an adult and not retaliate. However, we told them that if the attacks persist, that they should make it clear that they're not going to get pushed around. And after 3 times, they were free to make sure that they didn't happen anymore, however that played out. At a family picnic out in California, where my wife is from, my son was getting picked on by some distant cousin or whatever. He was about 4 years old at the time. And the first time he did exactly what we told him to do. He came and told Hannah and said, hey, this kid pushed me, and she addressed it, and they went back to play. A little while later, another physical altercation with my son took place, and he could be heard saying very sternly, that's 2, indicating that he was keeping track of this kid, and he pushed it one more time. It was nice that we could see that he understood, but also gave, because I wasn't there, but Hannah was, and she was very proud of her little boy at that time. And we still are, Talon. We love you. At the heart of retaliation is often pride. It's not so much that you have been physically injured, but rather that our pride has been damaged. If, however, we have been hungering for a right relationship with God, we will often find that our pride is less important than being an agent of God's love. Similarly, when Jesus talks about giving up your coat as well, he's talking about not letting pride get in the way and going above and beyond what is expected by setting aside pride and allowing God to express his love through you. Furthermore, when Jesus tells his followers to go the extra mile, he's referring to a Roman conscription law that allowed a Roman soldier to force a civilian to carry the soldier's gear, but only for 1 mile. Jesus is telling his followers to, again, push aside pride and desires for revenge and to go 2 miles instead. Learning to overcome our natural instinct to protect our pride is going to be a difficult road, but in the end, we will be known as followers of Jesus who have embraced a proactive love and grace in the face of wrongdoing. Being people who operate within God's love and demonstrate this love first, pride last mentality sets us up to tackle another topic Jesus addresses, which is loving our enemies. As with all the other case studies Jesus has used, which are all rooted in the law of Moses, this one is only partially rooted in the law of Moses. The hating one other's part is nowhere in the Old Testament. Love your neighbor comes from Leviticus 19:18, but if you read all the way from Genesis to the end of the Old Testament, nowhere does it talk about hating enemies. There's been a lot of debate about where this idea comes from, but I don't think it takes a huge stretch of imagination to figure out where the sentiment comes from. Israel, during the time, there's a period of time between the Old Testament and the New Testament that's typically referred to as the intertestamental period or the Second Temple period. It's about 400 years starting from the end of the prophetic writings of the Old Testament around the 5th century to the beginning of the New Testament events in the 1st century AD. It was a time of significant historical, cultural, and religious developments that influenced the context of the New Testament, including the occupation of Israel, first by the Greeks and then by the Romans. Despite reasonable treatment by the Greeks under Alexander the Great, the generals who succeeded him and took over many of the regions were not so kind. It got so bad that a revolt was formed and the Greek oppressors were essentially driven out. But then came the Romans, who had a very high demand for tax. So after a couple of centuries of being treated poorly, is it any surprise that they would have adopted this idea of hating one's enemies? But God's love, which is at the heart of all of this, demands something better from the followers of Jesus. We are to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. In fact, I'm a firm believer that once you get into a habit of praying for someone, whether you qualify them as an enemy or not, it is the most effective way to change the way you think about them. As Jesus points out, loving our family, although challenging at times, is fairly easy, and so is loving our friends. Doing that makes us no different than the people around us, the same people that Jesus refers to as pagans and tax collectors. But we are to be a city on a hill. And one of the best ways we can do that is by loving the people who are in our lives that are hard to love, or may even be our enemies. Remember, believer or not, all are made in God's image, and he makes the sun to shine and the rain to fall on everyone, not just those who love him. The last statement that Jesus makes in this passage can be a little discouraging. I think I just went right past it. Yep. Because the idea of us being perfect this side of eternity is something that we can't really fathom. But Jesus was calling not for perfection, but maturity in love and moral integrity, echoing the Father's holistic and unconditional love. This perfection is about aspiring to God's standard of love and righteousness, recognizing that while absolute perfection is beyond our reach here on earth, we are to continually strive towards embodying God's love and character in our lives. It's an invitation to spiritual maturity and a life lived in pursuit of holiness, grounded in love for God and others. Although rules and laws are required for games and constitutional republics to function, strict adherence to the letter of the law will not work for maintaining right relationships with God and others. Where do you see your efforts in all of this? Do you see how we are all guilty of breaking God's law? Or do you see evidence that you try to follow God's law, but with a motivation driven by fear and not love? If we take the time to do some honest reflection, we will see just how deep our sin goes, and that is why Jesus came. As I mentioned earlier, Jesus came to save us, not to condemn us. He lived a life devoid of sin, and he demonstrated what a heart that lives for God's glory looks like. And then, due to no fault of his own, he was sacrificed in our place on the cross to pay for our sins. But it didn't end there. It is through his resurrection that we have the hope of spending eternity with him. He has gone to prepare a place for those who have put their trust in him and have submitted their lives to him as king. He has sent his Holy Spirit to do the work in our hearts that we could not accomplish on our own, restoring us to our place as his representatives here on earth. The gospel is not just about forgiveness of sins, but the promise to give us a renewed heart that can truly glorify God. In our passage, Jesus teaches us how to keep in step with God's law as we grow as his people. Jesus revealed the depths of God's love by showing that the spirit of the law goes much further than the letter of the law. And we must remember that these are indeed case studies and are not the all-encompassing instruction of how to interact with God and others. But using them as a guide and with careful reading, prayer, and working with other believers, we can find what God's heart is in any situation. Through this portion of Scripture, we have seen the same reoccurring theme, living out the heart of God's law and being challenged to reflect God's perfect love in every aspect of life. We need to remember that the people in our communities, our workplaces, our schools, as well as the drivers who test our ability to reflect God's love, are all made in the image of God and should be treated as such. We must remember that to be righteous requires us to have good, healthy relationships with God and the people in our lives, and that we must hunger and thirst for that righteousness as we continue to mature in our relationship with him until the day that we stand before him, having been made perfect by the blood he shed on the cross. So we're going to spend a few minutes now. I want you to think about what we've talked about. Take a moment and pray. And then after some individual prayer, I will close with some prayer, and then we'll invite the worship team up here to close our service.